I'm Pieter Kruger, consultant clinical psychologist and professor of clinical psychology. And spending my time in the elite sport and business space, we get to deal with the questions around high performance and performing under pressure all the time. So the area we want to go in today in a bit more detail is a little bit of the basic neuropsychology behind performance under pressure. You'll notice from the previous talks that we are looking at certain themes around how do we maximize performance under pressure. But today specifically, in a very layman's, simple, understandable way, just want to explain to you how these various parts in the brain play together to influence performance under pressure. Now, if we start with one of the basic areas, which is around the limbic system, it's one of the most basic inner parts of the brain, but effectively it's the brain's primary emotional processing center. 7-8 substructures involved in there, but it plays a very important role in chemically processing the emotions that we experience. There's a very, very important particular part to it called the amygdala, which plays a very important role in emotional regulation, specifically things like the stress response, etc., playing a very important role also in the fight or flight response when we find ourselves in high pressure moments. But this limbic system in the brain is a very important one to understand, and knowing how to regulate emotion because of how it influences behavior and how behavior will then influence performance. So your limbic system, technically, you can probably access in 3 possible ways. So psychology is not the only way. The first way you can get in there is physically, chemically. So for example, swallowing a tablet is prescribed by a psychiatrist, or having a drink or illicit drugs. It's all things going into the bloodstream, going into the brain, some of it going through the blood-brain barrier, blocking and changing certain neural pathways. But we know, for example, these substances physically, chemically can change emotion. Silly example, but if you were to take a few drinks right now, in about 12 to 15 minutes, you're going to feel top of the world. But then alcohol, being a depressant, will unfortunately pull you down for the next 6 or 7 hours thereafter. So although the positive effect might last for half an hour or 45 minutes, it's a way we know it can change emotion, but it's hardly ever a lasting way, and therefore creating some more problems in the process as well. The second way you can get in there is through the autonomic and central nervous system. So going into every possible nerve ending in the body, being brain and body connected, you can send impulses bottom up. So via things like breathing exercises, yoga, Pilates, dance therapy, massage therapy, physical activity, movement, you can activate the central and autonomic nervous system, sending impulses back into the emotional part of the brain, which will also chemically change what's going on there. So something like exercise, for example, is not only a good way to work cortisol, the stress hormone, out of the system, but it also releases endorphins, which is a very important thing as a feel-good factor in the human body if you look at the chemical release of this particular substance. The third way, however, you can get into that part of the brain is where psychology comes into play. It's around the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, being connected through a superhighway of brain parts, partly reticular activation system, partly something called the singular gyrus around the edges of the inner part of the brain, but that will feed information back from the thinking part of the brain into the emotional processing center in the brain. Now, 2 things become important. It's firstly the content of what you think about, and then it's about the process of how you think. So what you think and how you think, process and content, both of these will create chemical and electrical activity, which will feed this back into the emotional center in the brain. Now, what is interesting, if you look at the design of the brain, for survival reasons, your limbic system processing emotion is processed and programmed to react 5 times faster than you can think. So we are effectively programmed to think first, react later. That is a great strategy in the jungle if you want to go for survival. It's not a great strategy in the boardroom when you have to sit there under pressure on the sports field, when you make snap decisions, or you have to execute when the pressure is really high. So what we see with the problem is the fact that the emotional center reacts so quickly. It means that once the limbic system lights up, amygdala goes into overdrive, release of cortisol, the stress hormone. If you look at a functional brain scan of somebody in an emotional state like that, that limbic system with activity almost lights up like a little Christmas tree. So you get blood flowing away from other parts of the brain, accumulating there, and the activity enhances quite significantly. Where if you look at large parts of the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part, blood tends to flow away from there, activity dies down, meaning when we are in a state of severe emotion, angry, frustrated, anxious, upset, your physical capability for logical thinking in the prefrontal cortex is significantly diminished. Now, why this part is so important, if you think about how it regulates most of your executive functions, things like judgment, decision-making, word processing, analytical thinking, deductive reasoning, error correction, behavioral choice, mood regulation. So a lot of things that will be very important to make you a functional, good, solid individual performing in the face of pressure and adversity. So once that part disengages, it's very difficult to stay in the moment and apply the skill set. So we always talk about this principle that it's not a lack of skill very often in high pressure moments, it's the inability to apply your skill under pressure. And you can see why that is the case, because once emotion takes over, the ability to actually think logically is significantly diminished. Now, one important positive thing, however, is the brain doesn't like thinking too much. It uses way too much of a very important biochemical neurotransmitter called dopamine. So if we don't have to engage in thinking, the brain will try to not do that. So it tries to automate as much of the processes as possible, which brings a third part of the brain into play, which is called the brain's autopilot. Technically, it's kind of a combination of something called your parietal lobe, where sensory motor integration sits. Also, kind of around the edges of the technically still part of the limbic system, the cingulate gyrus, and the basal ganglia there in the middle of the limbic system, which plays a very important part in behavioral instigation. So those things act together very much as the brain's autopilot, effectively 20 times faster than you can think. So the emotional center 5 times faster, conditioned responses or habits, if you will, 20 times faster, which effectively means that once there's something conditioned into that part of the brain, you can override the fight or flight response. This is how they train special forces, special law enforcement units, people in emergency medicine, what we try and do for sports people and what we try and do for business people. So once you understand that there's logic behind this and science behind this, it makes it easier to get the strategies in place. So if you don't have anything conditioned into the autopilot, you will fall back onto headless chicken syndrome, which is effectively going into a state of emotion. So we want to precondition things into the autopilot that once the brain picks up on a trigger, you don't go into headless chicken mode, start chasing your own tail and become all emotional about it, but that you know, once I see this trigger, the strategy is ABC, which means decision making is much faster, probably much more effective as well, and we contain and control the emotion. Doesn't mean you're going to be without emotion, but we've seen in high pressure environments, it's not about the absence of butterflies in your stomach, it's about getting them to fly in formation. And that is all about how we regulate thinking, but also have preconditioned responses once we go into that situation. There's a very important special forces saying that says a person will never rise to the occasion. They will always default to their highest level of preparation. And this is because of the fact that your autopilot kicks in there, and if there's nothing in there, you're going to find yourself in a state of emotion. So we'll talk about some strategies in terms of how do we get there. But the basic principle is once you understand this, now you can see why in some situations we are not at our best. But in order to get there, what are the key factors we need to have a look at in order to put a good system, strategy, and plan in place to help us to get there. Please join us for some of the talks to come to talk about some of the strategies of how we want to get there. But hopefully it gives you an overview and a flavor of some of the basic neurological concepts of performance under pressure. You are welcome to leave any comments in the comment section. Otherwise, looking forward to seeing you in the next one.